Welcome to our class today. We are continuing in this prophetic book written by a young Jewish man living in Jerusalem about 500 BCE, as he writes to his people, those living there in Judah, and also to those living in Babylon. To each of those groups, he has some very clear words, and I trust that those words he spoke some 2,500 years ago will speak to you and to me, as we will consider what God meant as he used that young man, and will try to learn what God has to say to us as 21st century people. As per usual, my usual method will take us through a chapter this Friday morning, and then we'll have plenty of time for discussion and questions in our final half hour. If you're watching this teaching on YouTube after our class, and you want a question answered, feel free to write me, bob@jewsforjesus.org.au, and I'll try to answer any queries if I'm able. For those in the room, if you don't already receive the email invitations to join this class live, please enter your email address just now, type it into the chat box, or write to our office, admin@jewsforjesus.org.au, and ask to be invited. We love to invite people. Also, if you don't mind, please read the chapter before you come to the class live. And if you're watching YouTube, pause your playback, read chapter 2, and then rejoin us. Thanks. Welcome back. Let's jump in. Today's lesson begins with a young man and a measuring line. He's like a surveyor. And this is vision number 3 in this quick listing of night visions out of 8 that Zechariah sees. Oh, by the way, for those using a Jewish text, a Masoretic text, or any number of Hebrew versions of the Bible, the second chapter actually begins with the first 2 visions from last week, the horns and the Trades. But as of today, we're all reading from the same text. Vision number 3 is about a surveyor who is to measure the length and width of Jerusalem. And you have to ask yourself, why is that included here? Chapter 1, verse 16 indicated that the point of Zechariah's talks, his clear message, was to get the Jewish people focused on the rebuilding of the temple. And as a spoiler alert, you should know that the temple was rebuilt even in his day, and that it saw then significant increase in the times of the Romans. That temple is the one where Yeshua visited and from which he spoke many times. That temple took 46 years to build. And Yeshua promised, he prophesied, he predicted that if people destroyed the temple, he'd rebuild it in 3 days. That's in John chapter 2. And the people mocked him at that, but he was insistent, and of course he was speaking about his own body. Back to Zechariah. The man in the vision says he's off to measure Jerusalem. That's it. That's the end of the encounter. Verse 3, one angel exits and another one enters. Nothing of these visions seems elaborate to me. It almost looks like a stage play. In fact, they're highlighting one thing over and over and over again. That is that the Jewish people have hope, and it's wrapped up in being in Jerusalem at that time and getting down to work and on the building project at hand. See, you have to remember that 7 to 10 decades before, under the guidance of the then prophet Jeremiah, God had instructed the Jewish people something very different. Chapter 29 of Jeremiah reads like this, quote, this is from verse 4. Thus says the Lord of hosts, the God of Israel, to all the exiles whom I have sent into exile from Jerusalem to Babylon, build houses and live in them, plant gardens and eat their produce. Take wives and become the fathers of sons and daughters. Take wives for your sons and give your daughters to husbands, that they may bear sons, and give your and daughters, and multiply there, and do not decrease. He goes on to say in verse 7 of Jeremiah 29, seek the welfare of the city where I've sent you into exile, and pray to the Lord on its behalf, for in its welfare you will have welfare. For thus says the Lord of hosts, the God of Israel, do not let your prophets who are in your midst and your diviners deceive you, and don't listen to the dreams which they dream, for they prophesy falsely to you in my name. I have not sent them, declares the Lord. That's Jeremiah 29, 4 through 9. You see, back in Jeremiah's day, the way to salvation was clear, and it's very different to the words in Zechariah's day. For the Jewish people to survive and to succeed in 587 BCE, we had to move to Babylon, to build cities, to seek the welfare of that city. We had to settle down. We had to get married. We had to build gardens and cities and listen to a few prophets. We had to pray for the welfare of the enemy country, the Babylonians, these are the no-goodniks. But the vision and the accompanying oracles that are now being told to Zechariah, and thus to the people of God, is that our hope is now moving back to Jerusalem. Get out of Dodge. Get out of Babylon. Stop seeking the welfare of that city. Move. In fact, the angel uses words that seem very active. The angel says, run in verse 4. And in verse 6, flee from the land of the north. Now that used to be a reference to Assyria, but since Babylon captured it, Northland implies Babylon. Again in verse 6, the four winds speak of whirlwind and thus motion, quick motion to me. And in verse 7, escape says the same to me. It's about getting out of town quickly. Does that remind you of anything from the Older Testament? How about the Exodus? We'd been there for 400 years, and in a few days, we're told to spoil the Egyptians and get out of Goshen and get out of Egypt. So, back to the vision. Angel number 2 comes out and tells retiring angel 1 to go back to the young man. That's a reference to Zechariah. The message? Go and tell him that Jerusalem will be inhabited significantly. Massive numbers of animals and people will be in town, not only for a festival or a pilgrimage. Like this week, we had Yom HaZikaron, that's Memorial Day in Israel. We had Yom Ha'atzmaut, the great Independence Day celebration, 75 years of modern Israel. But it's more than that, where populace increases for a day or a weekend or a festival. No, not for a pilgrimage. These are people who are moving in. Don't delay. Don't require the fences to be established first. Get with the housing industry. Let her rip. You know, when a construction site is established here in Australia around a new metro station, or when a bit of demolishing is going to take place, somebody sets up a perimeter. They establish the limitations. They put a green fence around it, and then they put up a wall, and the signage goes on saying, no handbills or else there will be consequences. We really don't know what's being built or demolished, but we know there's going to be action because we can see the fencing and the walls. Zechariah is being told to get on with the work without the required fencing. Don't build a wall. They would have built walls back in those days to defend the city. He said, you don't need to spend energy protecting. It's not yours anyway. You need to get the housing contracts and the main site to be the temple. Walls will be rebuilt by a fellow named Nehemiah some 75 to 80 years later. Your job? Get that temple built. God will take care of protection. He will be chomat esh, a wall of fire. Personally, he will see to us. Our role, build that temple. That will lodge him as significant inside the walls. It will be a daily reminder of God's grandeur and significance. He is not yet so to the people of God. He wants to be grand and significant to you and to me. More in verse 5. It says this, I will be the glory in her midst. This promise of God's majesty, I think, is the center point of this message to me. All the stuff, the walls, the fire, the angels, the measuring line, all that helped me to see what God wants to be. He wants to be all in all. He is not yet all in all. He wants the relationship with Israel and Judah to be complete. Yes, get the temple built, but it's not about the temple. Yeah, get back to Jerusalem, get back to the land, but it's not about the land. It's about God himself. Now in verses 6 and following, God speaks to those exiles who are still living in Babylon. Get out, he says. Yes, in verse 6, he says, I dispersed you. Now, some will argue, no, God didn't do it. The Babylonians did it. Some will say that the Assyrians before them caused the removal of the Jewish people in 722 BCE, and so they're the responsible agents. And it's true, there's some responsibility on the enemies of the Jewish people. God, however, says, I did it. Judgment begins with the house of God, by God. We had sinned and the warnings were clear. Stop, and if you don't stop, God said, I'll judge you. And so we as Jewish people were judged significantly. But now those 70 years of judgment are up, like the 400 years were up in Egypt. And God says, okay, get out, go back home. Think about it though. Jerusalem was not in repair. It was not flourishing. There were no gardens. It was not the land of milk and honey. I mean, it was the land of milk and honey, but it didn't look like it. It was destitute. No temple, no gardens. Where were the gardens? Babylon. Because they'd planted them. They'd made the place beautiful. Where was their money and comfort? Babylon. Where were most of the Jewish people living? Babylon. God is calling his people to exit comfort and walk with him in discomfort. That is a stretch. That's a tough call. God is calling us out of comfort into chaos, but it's ordered chaos under the God who controls things, under his lordship. Verse 8 has a tough phrase to translate. Very few agree on this one. It's 3 words, achar kavod shalachani. What does that actually mean? Ralph Smith, I think, in his commentary says, this is the most puzzling clause in the book of Zechariah. Is it to be taken as a purpose clause to mean that Yahweh sent Zechariah to get glory? Or as a temporal clause, after the glory, that is the vision, Yahweh sent me? Does glory refer to Yahweh, as the RSV indicates, or to the vision, King James says, or to heaviness or insistence, as Cherry and Baldwin believe? There are a lot of interpreters on this one. Kavod basically means to be heavy. Glory is heaviness. Baldwin suggests this should be translated, with insistence he sent me. Others amend or transpose the text in order to get a clear reading. Look, I agree with Michael Stead of Turamura, who translated it as, quote, for this is what the Almighty says, who for the sake of his honor sent me against the nations that have plundered you, end quote. That makes sense. It's the purpose. God is sending Zechariah for his own sake. But the Hebrew's a bit tough. I'll give everyone that. Listen to the rest of verse 8. Whoever touches them touches the apple of God's eye. Maybe you've heard that phrase as people talk about the Jewish people. This is the soft spot in God's vision. It's the Jews. Don't mess. Like Genesis 12 taught from the beginning, bless Israel, you get a blessing. Curse them, you be cursed. Babylon, you're going down for what you did to Judah 100 years ago. But don't be so dismissive. There's more to come. Verse 9, God is about to act for his name's sake. I almost see a magician waving his hand over a scene and smoke happens. Look, maybe I should stay with the Egypt motif and see the hand of God's judgment falling on the Egyptians. Verse 10, sing and rejoice before it happens. Hey, Jewish people, it's not yet done, but it will be. It's as good as done. Yes, you're right, it's incomplete, but the eyes of faith see the end from the beginning. God is about to act on your behalf and for his name's sake. Now, it will happen. Then it will be done. It's now and it's not yet. What's your job today? Sing and rejoice. Why? God is coming and will dwell with us. This notion of shachan, this idea of yashav, this idea of sitting and dwelling with us is something that I think from the very beginning, from the Garden of Eden, and certainly in the tabernacle imagery, and all the way to the end of the book of the Revelation, we see God dwelling with us, sitting with us. Yeshua is quoted as saying, behold, I stand at the door and knock. If anyone hears my voice and opens the door, I'll come in and sit with him. Sit with him. There's this notion of presence that gives me calm, comfort, and a reason to sing and rejoice. Now, where will that take place, according to this book? Jerusalem. Where? In the temple. Okay, so you get a picture of Jews hanging out at the temple. I think you probably see that. There's all these boys and almost all men rebuilding the temple. You see it, taking shape. And they're sweating, and they're drinking water that somebody's brought them. There's a lot of, it's all Jewish, isn't it? Look at verse 11, and buckle your seatbelt. Who will be there in the temple? Who will be there with God? Goyim Rabim, many nations, El Adonai, unto the Lord. Wait a minute. It won't only be the Jewish nation? This is shocking. In verse 8, God's judgment is coming against the nations, El Hagoyim. But now, only moments later in the text, the word of the Lord will make clear that Gentiles will be welcomed under God's big tent. There's room for all peoples. The measuring line, the measuring rod at the beginning of this chapter harkens to Ezekiel chapter 40 and the immense measurement of the city and the temple. It's not only for the Jews, it's for all peoples. Or Isaiah that says that my house should be a house of prayer for all peoples. Kol ha'amim, all the nations, all the peoples, whoever will. And we'll see that in Zechariah 14 at the end of this prophecy as well. Who is included in the Goyim Rabim, the many nations? Who's included? There might be Babylonians. There might be Assyrians. It's not the entire populace of Mesopotamia or the land of Shinar, but there will be people from every kindred and tribe and tongue and language in the family of God, in the largesse of God, in God's glory. Wow, what a vision. Verse 11 says that when those nations join, you will know that God is who he claimed to be. And those nations will be joined to us in such a way that together, Look what the title is. We are my people. This is God speaking. God claims that my people is not just the Jews. They're in Jerusalem gathered at the temple. It'll include all these peoples from all the different worlds. From Australia, from New Zealand, people from not just geographical variation, but from tribal affiliations. If only Peter had known that verse when the vision of the heavenly sheet dropped down in Joppa before he went to Cornelius's house. If only the disciples had understood that when Yeshua spoke to a Canaanite woman and healed her, or others who were not properly Jewish. If only Jonah had understood that when God told him there in Joppa not to go to Tarshish, but to go to Nineveh. God's people includes all who name the name of the Lord, Jews and non-Jews, men, women, barbarian, Scythian, slave, free, whoever names Yeshua as Lord, we are God's people. Verse 12, God again highlights the geography about which he's speaking. The English phrase Holy Land is only used here, the Holy Land. I mean, you might have heard that often in your youth or even recently about talking about Israel, the Holy Land. But it's not Eretz, it's not the land, it's Adamah, it's the holy ground. And that phrase, by the way, is the same that's used in Moses meeting God at the burning bush. Take off your shoes. This is holy ground. No wonder the chapter ends with the silence required in verse 13. Habakkuk ends chapter 2 of his prophecy with that same thought. Habakkuk says this, quote, "But the Lord is in his holy temple. Let all the earth be silent before him," end quote. We who encounter the Lord in Sydney, Melbourne, on Zoom, in our local church, in your neighborhood, in a paddock, or wherever, when we do, let all the earth be silent before him. Before you rush into a prayer meeting and start sharing your prayer list with the Almighty, be silent. Consider his purposes. Consider his love, his mercy, his intention for all people, even to you. Consider and be grateful. Be, and then speak. God's plans will be accomplished. Listen and learn, and then sing and rejoice and welcome others. So be it. Remember, you who are watching today, if you're not yet a follower of Yeshua and you see his love for you, his kindness extended, his offer of forgiveness available right where you are, submit to him. I mean, can you imagine if you're a Babylonian, you've been involved in your great grandfather or your granddaddy went and captured some of those Judeans and brought them back to your village in Babylon? And now you hear that they built this, you knew they built gardens and they married and they were part of the community and the fabric, and then they hear that the Jewish people are being called back to Jerusalem. Babylon's been defeated by the Persians. Cyrus has now allowed the Jewish people to go back. Your land is going to be devastated, and yet here you are, you're a Babylonian, and you hear, God has room for me there. I may not ever get to Jerusalem, but God would welcome me as one of his people. His kindness is extended. His offer of forgiveness is available right where you are. So submit to him and to his lordship, to his care, and your life will take on new meaning, new substance. And you'll have mates on this call and in your neighborhood and wherever you travel. The kingdom is advancing under the king. Chaos is subjugated. Life is available.